There's an absolutely extraordinary phenomenon that millions of people around the world experience daily, but that materialistic science struggles desperately to explain without admitting dimensions of reality that its narrow paradigm categorically denies. You are having a particularly stressful day at work, keeping all the frustration and anxiety internally without verbally expressing any of the emotional turmoil that is consuming you inside. You arrive home with a perfectly composed social mask, pretending to be normal, and before you even fully cross the door, your dog or cat that was sleeping peacefully in another part of the house appears running directly towards you, ignoring habitual greeting routines, and immediately begins demonstrating specific behaviors of comfort and acknowledgement of your disturbed emotional state that you have absolutely not communicated through any obvious verbal or even nonverbal channel that an outside observer could detect. Animals feel everything, and this statement is not an emotional exaggeration of sentimental owners projecting human qualities onto creatures that operate mechanically by blind instinctive programming, but precise recognition of the real capacity that animals possess to directly perceive internal states of other beings through mechanisms that completely transcend the model of perception, based exclusively on physical sensory information. Processing that materialistic neuroscience insists is the only possible way of knowing something about the mental worlds of other organisms. The truth that is deeply disturbing to the dominant materialist worldview, but which massive experiential evidence and even recent scientific research has reluctantly begun to confirm, is that animals not only detect emotional states through sophisticated reading of subtle bodily signals, such as facial microexpressions or changes in posture and vocal tone, although they certainly do so with impressive ability that often exceeds human capabilities to read nonverbal communication, but they have direct access to the subjective experiences of others through channels of perception that operate in subtle dimensions that conventional science has not yet developed instruments to measure objectively, but which traditions, contemplatives, have meticulously cataloged through millennia of careful observation phenomena that materialism arrogantly dismisses as impossible without even honestly investigating. When your horse refuses to be ridden precisely on the day you are emotionally unstable, but hides it perfectly from every human around. When your cat mysteriously appears always exactly when you are about to cry before a single tear falls or sound escapes. When your bird starts vocalizing specific patterns that it only uses when you are anxious. Even when you're sitting quietly without outwardly manifesting anxiety, these are not statistical coincidences that can be explained by random chance, but are repeated and verifiable demonstrations of perceptual capacity that operates through channels that materialist paradigm does not recognize exist. There's a difference between just listening and actually catching something that changes the way you think. And sometimes this change begins so subtly that you almost ignore it. But it persists, as if it wants to show you something beyond what is already familiar. This kind of insight doesn't come to everyone. Only to those who are ready to dig a little deeper. If this awakens something in you now, don't let it pass. Continue this path via the link in the description or the pinned comment. The question that naturally arises when we confront this reality of animal sensitivity to human emotional states is, through what specific mechanisms does this perception operate? And how can we understand a process that appears to violate fundamental premises about separation between individual minds that modern philosophy and science assume as a basic, unquestionable axiom? The answer that emerges both from ancient esoteric traditions and from more speculative frontiers of contemporary research into consciousness is that mind or consciousness is neither confined within the individual skull nor reducible to electrochemical processes in the physical brain, but is a field that extends spatially beyond body boundaries, creating energetic atmosphere or aura that can be detected by other organisms with biological receptors or perceptual capabilities tuned to appropriate frequencies. Each conscious being is constantly emanating energy that carries a unique signature of the current emotional, mental, and even spiritual state. And these emanations are not metaphorical but literal in the sense of being real vibratory patterns that propagate through a subtle medium that interpenetrates physical space, but that current scientific instruments cannot directly measure because they are calibrated only to detect aura phenomena that operate in the conventional electromagnetic spectrum. Animals in general, and especially those that live intimately with humans, have developed or maintained acute natural sensitivity to these subtle energetic emanations that modern humans have largely lost through cultural evolutionary processes that have privileged development of abstract symbolic language and analytical rational thought at the expense of more direct and intuitive ways of knowing that operate below the threshold of explicit verbal awareness. When you experience intense emotions such as deep fear that paralyzes, anger that boils beneath a seemingly calm surface, sadness that threatens to overwhelm you completely, or joy that makes your heart want to explode, You are not having a purely private experience occurring exclusively within isolated mental space, completely invisible to the outside world, but you are actively generating and emitting emotional energy that has a characteristic vibratory frequency detectable by any organism with appropriate sensory apparatus or consciousness open enough to perceive subtle dimensions of reality that materialism denies, but that are as real as any measurable physical phenomenon. Your dog does not need to see an expression on your face, hear the tone in your voice, or observe tension in your shoulders to know that you are anxious or depressed, because he can directly feel a change in the vibratory quality of the energy field that you constantly emanate, similar to how you can feel a change in temperature in an environment without checking a thermometer or detecting the presence of a person behind you without seeing them through subtle peripheral perception that operates automatically without the involvement of conscious cognitive processes. This capacity for direct empathic perception that animals consistently demonstrate through behaviors that correspond precisely to internal emotional states of humans that have not been communicated through conventional channels is not a mysterious paranormal ability reserved for especially gifted individuals, but is a natural faculty that all sentient beings possess to some degree, but that humans have atrophied through excessive dependence on symbolically mediated modes of communication that disconnect consciousness from more immediate ways of knowing the experiences of others. Young children often exhibit this same ability to directly sense the emotions of surrounding adults without the need for verbal explanation, and before developing the sophistication to interpret complex nonverbal cues, but most lose conscious access to this direct empathic perception as they are intensely socialized to rely exclusively on verbal language and logical reasoning as the only legitimate sources of knowledge about the mental states of others. Animals that never go through this process of cultural perceptual narrowing maintain a living connection with the ability to directly feel emotions throughout their entire lives, making them not only comforting companions, but potentially valuable teachers who can show us the way back to forms of perception and ways of being that we have lost, but that remain latent, waiting to be reactivated through appropriate practice and attention. But recognizing that animals deeply and accurately feel our emotions carries tremendous ethical implications that go far beyond simply appreciating the comforting companionship they provide during difficult times or marveling at the impressive perceptual abilities they demonstrate. If animals are constantly sensing, absorbing, and being deeply affected by emotional energy that we emanate consciously and unconsciously throughout each day, then we have a serious moral responsibility to care for our own emotional health, not only for our own well-being, but also out of consideration for vulnerable and sensitive beings who share environments with us and who have no choice but to be continually exposed to whatever emotional pollution we generate through psychological neglect, indulgence in chronic negative patterns, or refusal to do the inner work necessary to process trauma and develop basic emotional maturity. An animal living in a home where there is frequent explosive anger, chronic untreated anxiety, persistent depression, or constant verbal conflict is not simply passively watching human drama unfold from a safe distance, but is actively absorbing and being negatively impacted by the toxic emotional atmosphere that permeates the environment, often developing behavioral problems that are direct manifestations of secondary stress or even physical health conditions that have their roots in prolonged exposure to negative emotional energy that exceeds the animal's natural ability to process and neutralize through its own energetic cleansing mechanisms. This is not the animal's fault. It is simply responding with natural sensitivity to environmental conditions, but it is the direct responsibility of humans who have created or maintained harmful emotional atmospheres through behaviors that they could modify if they made a conscious effort to do so. For this reason, people who recognize the emotional sensitivity of animals and who choose to share lives with them assume an implicit ethical obligation to work diligently on their own emotional development, to seek therapy when necessary, to process unresolved traumas that continue to generate emotional pollution, to practice stress management and emotional regulation techniques such as meditation or regular exercise, and to make genuine effort to create as healthy, stable, and positive emotional atmospheres as life circumstances allow, not only for our own benefit, but out of respect for beings who depend on us and who offer us unconditional loyalty, even when we are creating conditions that are harmful to them, their well-being. The ability of animals to feel human emotions also manifests itself in more subtle and complex dimensions that include perception of hidden intentions, unconscious motivations that the person himself may not consciously recognize, and even probable future potentials based on current emotional and intentional trajectories. This is a fundamental reason why animals often react with obvious discomfort, persistent avoidance, or even defensive hostility to specific people who appear completely normal, friendly, and trustworthy to superficial human perception, that is based primarily on observable social behavior and verbal presentation, but who carry malevolent hidden intentions, deeply disturbed emotional patterns, or energies that are fundamentally incompatible, or even predatory that animals instinctively detect. Through direct energy field reading that completely contradict the carefully constructed social mask that person presents to the world. When your dog persistently growls at a seemingly harmless visitor, or your cat refuses to approach a specific person despite repeated and apparently genuine attempts at friendly interaction, conventional wisdom is to dismiss it as rude behavior that needs to be corrected through training or additional socialization, but a more prudent approach is to seriously consider the possibility that the animal is perceiving something about that person's true nature, real emotional state, or hidden intentions that you cannot detect through limited ordinary senses or superficial analysis of social behavior that can be easily manipulated by people skilled in concealment. There are literally thousands of documented stories of people ignoring repeated warnings from animals about specific individuals, only to tragically discover later that those people were in fact dangerous, dishonest, manipulative, or emotionally disturbed exactly as the animal tried to communicate through consistent defensive behavior or deliberate avoidance that was wrongly dismissed as meaningless. Learning to trust animals' superior perception of people's energetic quality and fundamental integrity can literally protect you from abusive relationships, elaborate deceptions, psychological manipulations, or even direct physical dangers that human intellect alone often does not detect until significant damage has already been done. This is not a naive suggestion that we should base all decisions about people exclusively on animal reactions, without also using our own informed judgment and reason, but it is recognition that we should give genuine weight and serious consideration to warnings that animals consistently provide and carefully investigate when they demonstrate marked discomfort or persistent refusal to interact with a specific person or situation, rather than automatically dismissing it as problematic behavior that needs to be suppressed or ignored. The extraordinary sensitivity of animals to emotional states also explains why they are used so extensively and effectively in varied therapeutic contexts, including animal-assisted therapy for people with complex trauma, debilitating anxiety, treatment, resistant depression, or other mental health conditions that do not respond adequately to conventional interventions. It is not simply that animal presence is vaguely comforting in the generic way that any pleasant stimulus might be, but that animals have a genuine and sophisticated capacity to perceive subtle emotional states of people with whom they interact from moment to moment, and to respond in ways that are specifically appropriate and therapeutically valuable to the particular needs they detect through direct empathic perception. Therapy dog working with severely traumatized child. It is not just providing passive companionship, but is actively reading the child's emotional state in real time, and dynamically adjusting own behavior to provide exactly the kind of presence and quality of interaction that child needs in that specific moment, to feel safe, seen, and supported, whether it is gentle playful energy to help the child out of paralyzing depressive rumination, or deep calming stillness to soothe acute anxiety that threatens to turn into a panic attack, or solid comforting physical presence to ease devastating feelings of isolation and emotional abandonment. This capacity for finely tuned and dynamically adjustable emotional responsiveness that therapy animals consistently demonstrate cannot be adequately explained as a mere result of extensive behavioral training or operant conditioning, because it requires direct and continuous perception of another person's constantly changing internal emotional states, and the ability to intentionally modulate one's own behavior based on moment-to-moment feedback about the effects of specific interactions on one's emotional state, something that would be completely impossible without true cognitive and affective empathy that involves genuine empathic understanding of the subjective experiences of other conscious beings. Recognizing this demonstrable reality of animals' authentic empathic capacity has profound implications, not only for how we use animals in specific therapeutic contexts, but for how we fundamentally think about the nature of animal consciousness in general and about appropriate ethical relationships between humans and other sentient species who share the planet with us. If animals can feel our emotions as deeply, accurately, and nuanced as converging evidence from multiple sources increasingly conclusively suggests, then they cannot be reduced to unconscious biological machines operating blindly by instinctive genetic programming, without meaningful inner lives, but must be recognized as genuine subjects of experience with rich and complex mental worlds that deserve serious moral consideration, comparable in principle, even if different in specific details to that which we accord other humans. Breeding, keeping, or using animals in conditions that cause chronic emotional suffering through severe social isolation, extremely restrictive spatial confinement, or complete lack of adequate mental and physical stimulation becomes not only a matter of direct physical cruelty, but of prolonged psychological torture of conscious beings capable of experiencing profound emotional distress that is as real and morally important as any suffering that humans experience. This realization should motivate urgent fundamental changes in how society treats animals in industrial agriculture that confines billions in terrifying conditions, in scientific experimentation that inflicts pain and fear without adequate ethical justification, in entertainment that exploits animals for profit while completely ignoring psychological well-being, and even in seemingly benign domestic contexts where animals are routinely kept in conditions that meet human convenience but systematically ignore fundamental emotional and psychological needs of sentient creatures who deserve lives worth living. The ability of animals to feel emotions also raises fascinating philosophical questions about the fundamental nature of empathy, and whether there is essential continuity of empathic capacity across all conscious species, or whether there are irreducible qualitative differences in how different types of consciousness experience and respond to the emotional states of other beings. Recent neuroscience research convincingly demonstrates that mammals possess mirror neurons and neural circuits associated with empathic processing that are structurally and functionally similar to those found in human brains, strongly suggesting that the capacity for empathy has deep evolutionary roots that predate by millions of years the emergence of symbolic language and complex abstract thought that humans mistakenly assume are necessary prerequisites for any form of sophisticated consciousness. But ancient contemplative traditions and mystical experiences reported across cultures point to the more radical possibility that true empathy operates primarily at levels that completely transcend specific physical neurological substrates, manifesting itself through direct connection between consciousnesses in subtle dimensions, where the rigid separation between individual subjects that characterizes ordinary experience is revealed as an illusion created by identification with physical form. An isolated ego, but which can be transcended through contemplative openness that allows direct perception of the internal states of others without the need for mediation, through external symbols or logical inferences based on observable behavior. From this more expansive, spiritually informed perspective, an animal's ability to feel human emotions deeply is not so much a special ability developed through specific evolutionary selective pressures as social mammals have faced, but it is a natural expression of a fundamental fact about the ultimate nature of consciousness, that at the deepest level of reality, all apparently separate individual minds are in fact interconnected through the unified field of universal consciousness, and that absolute separation between subjects that we take for granted is a persistent illusion created by limitations of ordinary perception that can be overcome through practices that develop sensitivity to more subtle dimensions of experience. Animals that have never developed the elaborate cognitive filters and defensive psychological barriers that humans systematically construct through processes of socialization and formal education remain naturally more open to this deep level of direct empathic connection, which is why they often seem to know intuitively what we are feeling before we ourselves even consciously recognize the emerging emotional state that is developing at unconscious levels of the psyche. This remarkable ability of animals to serve as accurate emotional mirrors, revealing truths about our real internal states that we would prefer to keep conveniently hidden from explicit awareness, is one reason why deep relationships with animals can be so psychologically transformative and spiritually healing for humans who are willing to pay honest attention to the feedback they receive. Animals gently but relentlessly force us to confront authenticity or lack thereof in our emotional lives because they cannot be fooled by the elaborate social masks or convenient psychological rationalizations we habitually use to avoid confronting difficult feelings that threaten carefully constructed self-images. When we try to pretend that we are well emotionally while in reality we are suffering deeply internally, an animal that knows us intimately does not believe in the superficial performance because it is reading the true emotional state that the energy field automatically transmits regardless of what social face it deliberately presents to the observing world. This radical and unrelenting emotional honesty that animals naturally bring to relationships can be intensely uncomfortable initially because it mercilessly exposes our favored psychological defenses and well-established denial mechanisms, but it also offers rare precious opportunity to live with much greater integrity and authenticity by constantly reminding us through silent but eloquent presence that there is an ever-present witness who clearly sees underlying emotional truth beyond all the facades we have so carefully constructed for ego protection. Consciously developing a deep and authentic relationship with an animal can thus become a genuine and powerful spiritual practice of cultivating radical emotional honesty and completely authentic presence, because we know viscerally that we can hide absolutely nothing from a companion who directly feels the reality of what is happening internally to us in each moment, regardless of what we say verbally or how we behave externally. The question of the extent to which different animal species share empathic capacities similar to those that humans possess, and the extent to which they experience and process emotions in qualitatively different ways due to differences in neural architecture and ecological context, is an area of active scientific investigation and ongoing philosophical debate. Extensive behavioral evidence and recent neuroscientific findings strongly suggest that at least socially complex mammals such as non-human primates, canids, felids, elephants, cetaceans, and even rodents experience basic emotions and some more complex social emotions in ways that are functionally similar to human emotional experiences, even though precise phenomenological details of how these emotions are experienced subjectively may differ significantly due to differences in specific neural structure and the particular evolutionary context of each species. Understand one thing: not everything that is valuable appears clearly from the beginning. Many only realize it later, when they no longer have access to the same moment. If you manage to recognize this now, don't hesitate. Access is in the description link and in the pinned comment. Heartbreaking, widely documented stories of elephants returning year after year to places where beloved group members have died and displaying behaviors that clearly seem to indicate deep and profound grief, lasting emotional memories, of dolphins heroically trying to help injured or sick companions even at the risk of their own safety, of crows that hold specific grudges against individual people who have treated them badly and even transmit this information to other crows, who then also avoid those people, of dogs that stop eating completely and become deeply depressed after the death of beloved owners. All this converging evidence powerfully suggests that the ability to experience complex and deep emotions and to form lasting, meaningful emotional bonds is not exclusive to humans, but is a widely shared characteristic of many, if not most, conscious beings we encounter. Beyond species with whom we share relatively recent evolutionary ancestry through the mammalian lineage, the question of whether and how more distantly evolutionarily related creatures like birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, or even invertebrates like octopuses and bees experience something genuinely similar to emotions becomes progressively more difficult to answer definitively, because they have nervous systems organized in such fundamentally different ways and inhabit perceptual worlds so radically different from our own that direct analogies become increasingly difficult, problematic, and potentially misleading. However, recent scientific studies have surprised many researchers by demonstrating apparently sophisticated cognitive abilities and behaviors that appear to indicate complex emotional states in animals that were previously categorically assumed to operate purely by mechanical instinctive reflexes, without any significant inner life, including crows and parrots that demonstrate problem-solving capabilities that rival primates, octopuses that exhibit distinct personalities and striking individual preferences, and even bees that appear to experience states analogous to optimism or pessimism, depending on recent experiences they have had. These empirically well-founded findings strongly suggest that consciousness and the capacity for emotional experiences may be much more widely distributed across the animal kingdom than traditional scientific materialism was willing to admit, based on questionable philosophical premises about the necessary relationship between neural complexity and mental sophistication, and that perhaps we should be considerably more epistemically cautious about assuming that only creatures with brains, structurally similar to our own, are capable of rich, subjective experiences that deserve genuine moral consideration. From the point of view of spiritual traditions, as opposed to purely scientific ones, all life forms without exception are manifestations of a single universal consciousness, taking countless different forms to explore infinite possibilities of experience, and therefore all necessarily possess some degree of sensitivity and capacity to respond significantly to the environment, including emotional states of other beings with whom they interact, even if the specific manifestation and degree of sophistication of this capacity vary tremendously depending on the particular physical structure and specific evolutionary level of each individual creature. The practical implication of this more inclusive and humble perspective on animal consciousness is that we should treat all living beings with basic respect and fundamental moral consideration, honestly recognizing that even when we cannot prove definitively through conventional scientific methods which particular creature experiences emotions in ways that we would recognize as directly comparable to our own, absence of conclusive proof in no way constitutes proof of absence of capacity, and that the ethical principle of precaution strongly suggests that we should err in the direction of attributing more sensitivity and capacity for suffering rather than less, when there are potential consequences of being tragically wrong and seriously underestimating beings' capacity to experience suffering are so morally serious and irreversible. This stance of appropriate epistemic humility and prudential moral generosity toward all other beings is consistent both with recent scientific discoveries about the previously unsuspected sophistication of animal consciousness and with the perennial wisdom of contemplative spiritual traditions that have always taught fundamental reverence for all life as a sacred expression of the divine, manifesting itself creatively in multiple, incomprehensibly diverse forms. Returning specifically to the practical question of how animals sense our emotions and what this means for the everyday relationships we have with them, there are important dimensions to how this extraordinary emotional sensitivity affects the observable behavior and general well-being of domestic animals that we need to consider. Aim carefully if we want to be truly responsible and compassionate guardians. Animals that are constantly and chronically exposed to intense negative human emotions, without adequate opportunity to fully process and release the dense emotional energy they inevitably absorb, may develop what we might appropriately call secondary trauma or vicarious stress, manifesting behavioral and even physical symptoms such as chronic generalized anxiety, repetitive compulsive behaviors, increased aggression unexplained by current conditions, marked social withdrawal, or health. Conditions that have demonstrable roots in prolonged exposure to a toxic emotional atmosphere that exceeds the organism's natural ability to maintain homeostatic balance. Recognizing this demonstrable reality of the direct and substantial impact that our habitual emotional states have on animals that live with us should motivate much greater conscious care in how we manage our own emotions on a daily basis, and increased genuine effort to create healthy emotional environments that benefit all inhabitants, including specifically non-humans who have no voice to complain about harmful conditions we are creating through emotional neglect. The journey of fully recognizing and living authentically in accordance with the transformative truth that animals feel. Everything does not happen instantly, nor is it always linear or easy, but unfolds gradually through months and years of consciously sustained attention to how our internal states affect beings we love and who depend completely on us to create conditions where they can thrive, rather than merely survive under chronic stress. Every moment we choose to pause before exploding into destructive anger and process frustration in a more constructive and mature way, because we honestly recognize that outburst would needlessly traumatize, the present sensitive animal is a precious opportunity to develop greater emotional control and psychological maturity that profoundly benefits not just the animal, but literally every relationship and one's own long-term well-being. Each time we make a conscious effort to intentionally elevate one's own emotional state through regular spiritual practice, vigorous physical exercise, or genuinely nourishing social connection because we sincerely want to create a more positive and healthy atmosphere for companion animals, is a valuable investment in overall quality of life that pays abundant dividends far beyond the immediate specific context that originally motivated action. May we have the wisdom to fully recognize the extraordinary sensitivity of animals, the humility to learn from capabilities they naturally possess but which we have lost, and the courage to live authentically in the light of truth that reveals the deeply interconnected nature of all consciousness, manifesting through infinitely diverse forms in the living, conscious cosmos, creatively exploring own limitless possibilities through each unique being that arises to contribute an indispensable. Particular note to the eternal symphony of conscious evolution toward ever more complete realization of unconditional universal love that is simultaneously the source and destination of every journey, through all possible dimensions of being and experience. The gradual process of learning to read increasingly subtle and nuanced signals of how an animal is responding moment to our emotional states also progressively develops capacities for empathic perception and focused attention that become increasingly refined and discriminative with dedicated and conscious practice, eventually allowing us to detect extremely delicate nuances of an animal's emotional state that previously went completely unnoticed by ordinary, untrained consciousness. This systematic education of empathic perception through prolonged, careful observation and lovingly sustained attention creates generalizable and transferable skills that significantly improve the ability to accurately read emotional states of all beings, including other humans, making it possible to respond with much greater sensitivity and more accurate appropriation to the genuine emotional needs of people in our lives as well. There's also a dimension of deep and genuine gratitude that naturally emerges and deepens when we honestly contemplate the extraordinary gift that animals continually offer by being generously willing to share lives with us, despite the glaring imperfections we exhibit, and by patiently bearing the brunt of our emotional turmoil with such consistent loyalty and such unconditional love. This gratitude is not a vague feeling of superficial appreciation, but a visceral recognition of the real sacrifice that animals routinely make by voluntarily absorbing emotional pollution that inevitably we have faithfully generated and remained unconditionally devoted despite numerous flaws, and obvious limitations that we regularly demonstrate. Sincerely honoring this unwavering loyalty and unconditional love requires that we strive seriously to live up to the sacred trust they place in us, working constantly and diligently to become better, more conscious guardians, better, more present and attentive companions, and fundamentally better human beings, more emotionally and spiritually developed in all aspects of character and conduct. The honest recognition that animals feel everything also significantly opens the door to exploring much deeper dimensions of interspecies communication and connection that completely transcend limited conventional modes of interaction based primarily on unilateral verbal commands and behavioral conditioning through reinforcement and punishment. When we begin to genuinely perceive and treat animals as emotionally complex and morally significant subjects with rich and valuable inner lives, rather than as convenient objects to mechanically train or instrumentally control, relationships naturally evolve toward a much more equal and mutually respectful partnership, characterized by genuine reciprocal consideration for the well-being and preferences of both parties involved. This type of fundamentally transformed relationship, based on full recognition of the animal's subjectivity and genuine emotional agency, is qualitatively different in essential nature from traditional hierarchical models of unilateral ownership or domination, offering real possibility for deep intimacy and authentic mutual understanding that beneficially transforms both participants in ways that are impossible to fully predict in advance, but that are undeniably real when experienced directly. Inspiring stories of people whose lives were literally saved by animals, who detected serious medical emergencies before obvious symptoms manifested, who were profoundly healed from devastating depression through the unconditional presence of an animal companion, or who found renewed purpose and restored meaning through lovingly caring for a rescued animal, all testify eloquently to the genuinely transformative power of relationships that fully honor animals' full emotional capacity, and that enable truly authentic connection based on courageous shared vulnerability and genuine mutual care. These are not rare exceptional cases, but are representative examples of what becomes naturally possible when we systematically remove artificial barriers of ingrained speciesist prejudice and courageously open ourselves to genuinely respectful relationships with beings of other species who have so much to offer generously and teach patiently, if only we are truly willing to listen humbly and learn respectfully. As more people progressively awaken to the undeniable reality of animals' deep emotional sensitivity and begin consciously to live up to the full ethical implications of this transformative recognition, we can reasonably expect to see significant and lasting cultural changes in how society treats animals in literally every context, from domestic companionship to industrial agriculture, invasive scientific research, and exploitative entertainment. Growing movement globally toward greater genuine compassion and serious consideration for the integral emotional well-being of animals is clearly already underway and gaining substantial momentum as rigorous scientific evidence impressively accumulates and public awareness rapidly expands. But truly complete transformation of deeply ingrained cultural attitudes and social practices established centuries ago fundamentally requires that individuals make conscious and committed personal choices that consistently reflect authentic values of universal respect and genuine empathy for all sentient beings without exception. Each person who deliberately chooses to live more consciously and responsibly in relation to a life-sharing animal, who makes a sincere effort to deeply understand and fully honor a companion's rich emotional life, who consistently treats an animal as a subject worthy of full moral consideration rather than an object for convenient use, contributes significantly to broader and more fundamental cultural change toward a radically more ethical and genuinely compassionate relationship with the entire natural world and all beings that inhabit it interdependently. This is not just a limited matter of being kinder superficially to individual pets, but of recognizing deeply fundamental such essential interconnectedness of all life and tremendous responsibility we have as beings with disproportionate power to dramatically affect the well-being of countless other creatures through seemingly small choices we routinely make on a daily basis. The ultimate and most transformative message that animals persistently bring through their extraordinary ability to deeply feel our emotions is fundamentally about real possibility of transcending paralyzing illusion of absolute separation and living consciously in active recognition of the fundamental unity of all consciousness, manifesting creatively through multiple, incomparably diverse forms. When we directly feel visceral, empathic connection with an animal, when we experience a precious moment of deep mutual recognition where rigid boundaries between self and other temporarily dissolve, revealing underlying continuity, we touch the essential truth that all mystical traditions unanimously point out, that separation is a constructed illusion, and that, at the deepest possible level of reality, we are all unique expressions of the same universal consciousness infinitely exploring. unlimited possibilities of experience through countless temporary individual forms. Animals who have never separated themselves as radically from this fundamental truth as humans have tragically done through strongly individualized and isolated ego development serve as precious living reminders and practical bridges back to the more holistically integrated and relationally connected consciousness that is our original birthright, but that the overwhelming majority have completely forgotten how to consciously access and authentically inhabit in ordinary everyday life. If you're still following this far, this already puts you in a different position, because most people get distracted, lose focus, and miss exactly what could bring answers. But you are still present. So take advantage of this point. Go now through the description link or the pinned comment and delve deeper into what started to make sense. May we have spiritual wisdom to learn humbly from animals, about ways of being and perceiving that we have lost but that remain accessible, epistemic humility to honestly recognize that beings that culture arrogantly classifies as inferior possess capacities that we desperately lack, and moral courage to live authentically and consistently in the full light of revolutionary truth that constantly reveals about the deeply interconnected nature of all consciousness, manifesting through infinitely diverse forms in the conscious living cosmos by creatively exploring own limitless possibilities through each absolutely unique being that temporarily arises to contribute particular indispensable note. For a magnificent eternal symphony of upward conscious evolution toward progressively fuller realization of totally unconditional universal love that is simultaneously the primordial source and ultimate destination of every journey through every possible dimension of being and experience. And that through this transformative journey of gradual awakening to truths that animals naturally embody and patiently demonstrate, we may ultimately become fully developed human beings who honor all forms of life, who live in respectful harmony with all creation, and who manifest the unconditional love that animals so perfectly and consistently show us through the unwavering loyalty and absolute devotion that they generously offer, regardless of our glaring imperfections and numerous flaws. This is a sacred message and priceless gift that comes through the remarkable capacity of animals to feel deeply and respond compassionately to everything we experience emotionally. And it is a solemn responsibility that we can honor worthily only by living into the full height of possibility and potential that this transformative recognition unequivocally reveals, allowing relationships with animal companions to become sacred portals to fuller awakening of latent human capacity for universal empathy, deep, authentic connection, and completely unconditional love that faithfully mirrors extraordinary devotion that they so consistently and consistently demonstrate, unconditionally towards us through all the circumstances and challenges of shared life. By fully recognizing that animals feel everything, we make a sacred commitment to live with greater emotional awareness, greater psychological maturity, greater universal compassion, and greater personal integrity in all aspects of existence, thus honoring the precious gift of sensitive presence they share with us, and contributing to a collective evolution towards a truly compassionate civilization that respects and protects all sentient beings as sacred manifestations of consciousness. Divine existence exploring infinite possibilities of love through incomparably diverse forms in an eternal dance of continuous creation unfolding moment by moment through choices we make individually and collectively about how we treat all beings with whom we share this precious and interconnected planet, where each creature's destiny profoundly affects and is affected by the well-being of all others in a complex web of interdependence that unites us inseparably into a single community of conscious life evolving together toward a brighter future of universal harmony and unconditional love fully manifested.